Okay, so here's the new turbo with the wastegate actuator installed. Installing the wastegate actuator, you just want to make sure there's no play here on this lever that controls the gate. Now this is actually 2 weeks later from the last spot because a friend of mine that goes by Morning Z on focusrs.org convinced me that I should replace my downpipe while I have all of this disassembled, and I agreed. So I put in an order for it, and it is here now. And there it is, the Depot Racing catless downpipe. So the downpipe is somewhat installed. I had to leave it loose so I can reconnect the coolant line that goes into the block right in that area. I've had time to do some research and have a whole list of parts that need to be replaced. I'll put those parts and their part numbers in the description of this video. The first one is the studs that hold the turbo to the exhaust manifold. When you loosen the nuts that hold the turbo to the exhaust manifold, sometimes the studs come out instead of the nuts. That happened on 2 of the studs, so I have the replacements here, and that's going to be the first thing I do for the install. So there's the exhaust manifold. As you can see, we have 2 studs missing, but 2 of them are in place, so I'm going to replace the 2 studs that are missing. These studs require an E8 female Torx socket. So here's the exhaust manifold with the 2 new studs and a new gasket. I've moved the exhaust flange studs from the old turbo to the new one. They were in good shape. The reason that I replaced the exhaust manifold studs is because the dealership had replaced this turbo once before, and they obviously, those exhaust manifold studs came off and they put them back on and totally stripped them out, so they needed to be replaced. That's probably also the case for why the bolt on the coolant lines got stripped out, because the dealership tech way over torqued it. I've decided to put the turbo assembly back in the way it came out, and it came out with the coolant lines installed on it still and one of the oil lines installed. So I'm going to go ahead and get those put back on before putting this assembly into the car. So here's the coolant lines where they go back into the turbo. I've removed the O-rings from there and there, and you see there's some blue residue left from the old O-rings. We're going to spray some brake clean on that and use this brush to clean off the old O-ring residue. Okay, these coolant lines are clean now. You see there's no more blue in that area. I ended up using that brush because it had stiffer bristles. The one thing you don't want to do is use a metal brush, because that will leave scratches and cause it to leak. So now I have the new O-rings. I've put them in some coolant, lubricated with some coolant, and I'll put those on. Okay, the new O-rings are installed and lubricated, and this is ready to be bolted onto the new turbo. You see how those plates overlap, and then they have the one hole that goes through. It's the shorter one that goes on the bottom towards the turbo. You see how that one is short and the one on the left is longer. That's how you know which plate to put on the bottom. Okay, the bolt that holds on the coolant lines to the turbo assembly needs to be torqued to 89 pound-inches. So here's the banjo fitting on the other side of those coolant lines. Those copper crush washers need to be replaced, so I'm just going to grab them with a pair of pliers and screw them out. Okay, got the old crush washers off, and I think I'm just going to set this bolt aside until I'm ready to screw it into the block so these new washers don't get lost. Here's the new oil supply tube that I'm going to put on the turbo assembly before putting the turbo assembly back in the car. You can see it has one of the O-rings similar to the coolant lines. I'm going to rub a little bit of oil on that, and then it goes into the hole just above the coolant lines right there. The oil supply line is torqued to 89 pound inches, just like the coolant lines. Here's the view from underneath. There are the 4 studs coming out of the exhaust manifold, and we're going to lift the turbo up there and place it on those studs and loosely fasten the bottom 2 nuts. Okay, I had to undo one of the studs in the exhaust manifold so we can work the turbo back up into position. Okay, with the help of my neighbor from working from up top, we were able to guide the turbo onto the 3 studs and then screw in the 4th stud that we had to undo to maneuver it into place. Before tightening anything down, you want to make sure you get this heat shield into place, because once everything's tightened down, the heat shield won't slip up through there. I've got the heat shield and the downpipe pushed out of the way, so now I can install the coolant line banjo fitting right there into the engine block. Alright, that banjo is a 10mm Allen, and it gets torqued to 22 pound-feet. Okay, next I'm going to install the oil supply line that we pre-installed into the turbo assembly. Here it is here. Goes into this hole right there. And this one also gets 22 pound-feet. I'm going to leave the oil return line off for now. It comes out of there, goes into there, because if you may recall, that got in the way when we were taking the PTU off. So we'll install that after the PTU is back on. Now I'm going to reattach these vacuum control lines. It's pretty obvious where they go back to. I came from the top to attach these 2 control lines. Now I'm going to tighten the 2 lower nuts on the exhaust manifold that have been loosely holding the turbo in place. And the procedure is to tighten one of them down to 18 foot-pounds and then the other one down to 18 foot-pounds. And go back to the first one and do it 37 foot-pounds, and then the second one 37 foot-pounds. Okay, the bottom 2 nuts are torqued down. The heat shield is on the top 2 studs, and I'm going to use the same procedure, the same torquing procedure, to torque down the top 2 nuts. The top nuts that hold the heat shield on are torqued down, but before I did any of this stuff on the manifold, I forgot to mention that I connected the water line up here, which is right there if you see that hose clamp. And what I did was change the squeeze clamp with a regular hose clamp because it was just easier to use. So the turbo is installed. While I was up top, Brian was connecting the downpipe to the turbo. These nuts here are one-time use nuts. They'll be in the parts list. Torque them down to 35 pound-feet. Don't forget to put this bolt back in the heat shield like I did. Now I'm going to have to do it around the PTU. Okay, so I just manhandled the PTU back into position and started all of the bolts. We had the 3 here, the 2 up top. And we did not connect the vacuum line on the top yet because when we were taking off the top bolt, that vacuum line was in the way. And you can reach up around this side and get at the vacuum line. So we're not going to connect the vacuum line until we have all 5 bolts tightened down. So Brian figured out that you can access the top bolt much easier through the wheel well. Okay, we've got the PTU snugged up against the transmission, and it turned out the best way to do that is to walk all 5 of them in to make it tight. And it's best when you go to tighten it for the first time to tighten the top ones, and that will draw it completely in, and then go back and forth and just work your way around all 5 of them, move them in slowly and evenly. And you know you got it snug against the transmission when the PTU brace bolts start, because that means that it's all the way that way. And these were able to start with my fingers which that means that the PTU is secured against the transmission. I'm going to tighten those PTU brace bolts and then reach up around here and connect the vacuum line that's up on top. Okay, the vacuum line up top is connected. These coolant lines are connected, and this electronic control line is connected. It gets fastened to the motor along here. And I left these off in case we got to pull it off. When you put this on, remember this, pull this tab out, push it on, and then push that white tab down. Okay, so the last thing before we check for leaks is the oil return line for the turbo. Just put this up here. For this oil return line, those are 8mm bolts, and they're torqued to 89 pound-inches. And I also forgot to mention that you want to oil the gaskets the same as we did for the intake line. So I've loosely installed the hot side charge pipe. We're just going to idle the engine and bring up the oil pressure and check for leaks, so this doesn't have to be completely installed. Okay, so we let it idle for about 10 minutes. It drank a lot of coolant, so I had to keep filling that up, ran out. No leaks, everything's dry, so that's great. We're going to call it a day, finish up tomorrow and go make some boost. Okay, it's the next day and I'm ready to finish this up. The first part is going to be something I've kind of been dreading because this is all done by feel. This is the PTU heat shield. My strategy is going to be to get these two bolts started and kind of snug, but still with a little bit of play, and then go for this one. And of course, the longest bolt is the one that goes into the hardest to reach hole. The PTU heat shield is installed. The first two bolts were pretty easy. I struggled for a long time with that last bolt way in the back. Almost gave up a couple times, but pride of ownership kept me going. Now I'm going to connect the drive shaft to the PTU. I can spin the drive shaft around. You see that light coming through the hole there? I think that's how I'm going to line up the holes. Okay, the PTU is connected to the drive shaft. My system of looking for the light through the holes didn't work. I ended up having to move the drive shaft back off the PTU and look for the holes and find the starting hole that way. In hindsight, I would mark the junction there before removing any bolts, and I think I'll go back in the video and say that, so you probably already know that. Also, I'm guessing that it's best to tighten these bolts down in a star pattern, and that's what I did. And there are no torque specs for this, so I just tightened them down as hard as I could with tightening the bolt with one hand and holding the drive shaft with the other. Well, I think the axle is the last major piece that needs to be reassembled. We'll start that by putting the bearing brace back in, right here in these holes. Okay, the bearing brace is in. You can see that here. I decided to mock up this hard pipe, not really connect it, just so I can connect this small piece before putting the axle in. I've got my little piece of charge pipe secured and the hard pipe out of the way, so I think I'm ready for the axle. Okay, I got the axle installed. As you can see, some of the shiny part is still showing, but what's important is that the bearing is centered on the bearing brace. If you jam the axle past this point, you can damage the shaft seal. I got the axle started into the hub. I got this tool from Ford. I'll put the parts number in the parts list. It will pull the axle back up through the hub. This part screws onto the axle, and this outer ring lays against the hub, and you turn this bolt, turn this nut, and that will pull the axle up through the hub. Just before you do this though, you want to make sure that the axle is started on the threads in the hub. One way to confirm that is to spin the hub, and you see the axle is turning also. That means it's started onto the threads inside the hub. I got the tool screwed all the way onto the axle. That required this nut to be unscrewed almost all the way. So now that that's together, I can turn this nut here. As I turn this nut, it will pull the axle up into the hub. As you can see, the axle has been pulled up through the hub. Now I need to connect the lower control arm's ball joint to the hub. I already have this crowbar in the hole on the lower control arm. I can use that to pull the control arm down so I can work that ball joint into the hub. That was a bitch, but it's in. Doing it single-handedly is not easy, but if you have to do it, laying down and looking at it from this angle turned out to be the easiest way. I could work this crowbar with my leg or my hand. I could watch the angle of the ball joint as it went up into here, and you just kind of have to remember where the steering wheel is. In my case, the steering wheel is turned all the way to the left, so I was kind of making the mistake of trying to get it into the ball joint with the hub kind of facing forward. But when I got down into this position and started working it and I could see what was wrong, I got it in pretty quick. All right, the bolt and nut that hold this lower control arm to the hub, they're one-use items as well. And this one, I can tell why. It comes from the factory with some sort of Loctite on it. See if I can focus that. So I think this bolt and nut is like $1, so it's worth buying. And it'll be in the parts list in the description. That bolt and nut is on. The nut faces forward. I have my new axle retainer nut started. This is a one-time use item as well. I'll have the part number in the parts list. For this, you're going to need somebody to stand on the brake, and this gets torqued down to 60 pound-feet. The next thing to do would be to install the charge pipes, but I'm going to change the oil first. So before I put the charge pipes on, I wanted to check the PTU oil level. That's the oil level plug right there. It's a T50. I took it off and oil came squirting out, and so I quickly put it back on. So the oil is supposed to be up to that plug, so it has enough oil in it, that's for sure. The charge pipes are installed and secured. The intake has been tightened up. I've topped off the coolant and the oil, and we are going to go make some boost. I've let the engine warm up and settle down. I'm ready to give it some revs and see if we can make a little bit of boost here. Oh yeah, yes. That's killer. Time to button up the last couple things. First one being this cross member that goes across under the front of the drive shaft. It's got 2 bolts on either end and 4 nuts in the middle. Brace bar done. 15 millimeter bolt here, 18 millimeter nut. Under tray on. Car down and cowling on. Boost!